Welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about fear, and it's something that we deal with on a day to day basis. Maybe you're facing a difficult conversation that you've been putting off for months, or maybe you want to embark on a new project or a new job that tests your limits. Maybe you want to move to a new city or start a new relationship. Any of those that I've mentioned can provoke fears and anxieties that can pin you down, and you can suddenly feel trapped before the situation even unfolds. It is a timeless truth that many of the things we worry about never come to happen, but our imaginary fears can have real consequences. Those fears can cloud our reality and can invoke other emotions, such as anger or grief. Those things will cloud our vision and obscure us from what's really going on, to the point that it might even paralyze us. There's a good quote written by Seneca that says, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality." But what can we do to take back control in our lives? What can we do to go back to our effective selves, ready to face whatever challenge comes next? I'm going to talk about the Stoics' way of dealing with fear because by far they provided a concrete, powerful, yet effective system for dealing with fear. The first that they do is that they practice the premeditation of evil, or as it called in their times, premeditatio malorum, which is the negative visualization of the worst case scenario, the thing that you currently fear that's preventing you from taking any action. You visualize what is the worst case that can happen if you face this kind of issue and write actions to overcome this issue. But instead of actually just visualizing this kind of worst case scenario and writing actions, there is an easier way to do this. And there's a way that is called fear setting that utilizes the idea of the premeditatio malorum. It was created by Tim Ferris, and he wrote it in a way that it constitutes of 3 pages. The first page, he used to write, "What if I," and the thing that he feared, or the thing that he wanted to do, whether it is starting a company or traveling to a new country or changing your job. He would put 3 columns. He would put a define column, a prevent column, and a repair column in the first page. You write about what you're fearing or causing you anxiety or whatever you're putting off. That is the question. In the define column, you write down all the worst things that you can imagine happening if you took that step. Let's say that if you want to leave your job and go to a new job, what is the worst thing that can happen? You would write from 10 to 20 points. In the prevent section, you would write down the answers to each point that you've written in the defined column. You might write multiple points for one issue in the defined column. But the thing is, in the prevent column, you write down the answer to each bullet point that prevent from happening or decrease the likelihood of happening. So let's say you wrote something that you went to this job. One of the worst things that can happen is that you didn't pass the probation period. Okay, how can you prevent not passing the probation period? You would write out points on how to actually sustain this probation in the probation period and nail the job that you wanted. In the repair column, if the worst case scenario happened, what can I do to repair the damage even a little bit? Or I could ask for help in case it happens. So back to the you want to change your job and you're still under the probation period. Let's say that you didn't pass the probation period and you didn't get the job. What can you do? This kind of scenario that happened. What you do in the repair section is that you would start to search for a new job, or you might ask your previous employers that rejected you in the probation period to ask what are the things that you did wrong, to understand what you currently did, and to prevent this kind of issue in the future. You might even ask them if they can recommend you somewhere else, or you might ask a friend if they know someone that can help you get a job. But the case is that in the repair column, if one of the things that happened in the defined column, which is the worst thing you can imagine happen, what can you do to lessen up the damage or repair the things that you currently faced? The second page, you'd ask yourself the question and write the answer of it, since it's the contributing factor of why you're doing this event or overcoming something in the first place. This question is, what might be the benefits of an attempt or partial success? The idea behind this page is to identify the base hit of doing or achieving this milestone, as in, what am I benefiting from this? If there are no benefits out of this, then there shouldn't be a reason of doing this action in the first place. You should consider taking time on this page. Consider spending more than 10 to 15 minutes at least on this. The idea behind this page is that if you did this action and it provided you some sort of a partial success, or was a decent attempt, what am I doing this action in the first place? What are the benefits? If it's not going to benefit you in the beginning, then there shouldn't be a reason to fear this kind of thing, because the benefits are not much more than the fear itself. So let's say, for an example, you want to change your job. What happened if you changed your job and you passed the probation period? But maybe this job that you're going towards might not provide much more than your previous job. Maybe this partial success that you currently have faced with is that you're now dealing with a better environment than you were before. Maybe the payment might be not like your previous employment, but you're now in a better position than you were before. So, is this new benefit outweighs the effects of doing this certain thing that you've been fearing? If yes, then you should proceed. Otherwise, you shouldn't be fearing this thing in the first place. The third page, and it is the most crucial and important page of them all, which you cannot skip it actually, and it is called the cost of inaction. He recommended putting three columns, which is 6 months, 1 year, and 3 years, but you can stretch on this as much as you want. The idea behind this is that what would happen to you if you didn't do anything, from an emotional part, physical, financial, or anything that you might think it's going to affect you? Humans are very good at considering what might go wrong if we try something new. But what we don't often consider is the atrocious cost of inaction or doing nothing at all. If I avoided this action or decision, or similar things like this action or decision, what might my life look like in the next 6 months or 1 year or 3 year? You might write as much as you want of how many years. You might think that it's going to affect you after 5 years. But write as much details as possible, because this is the most important page of them all. It's not much more than the fear that we actually feared, but what would happen if we didn't take any action? What if we stayed at that job that we didn't want to change because we feared that we might go to a worse job? Or maybe we wanted to move to a new place, but we feared that this new place might not be the place that we expected, so we stayed in the same place. Or maybe we didn't go into the relationship that we wanted, so we decided to not undergo this kind of relationship, whether it's romantic or it's a business relationship. Opportunities might rise or go. But what happened if I didn't do any action? Let's take, for example, that I want to do a business deal with someone and I feared this current thing and I didn't do it. What would happen if I didn't do this? From 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, or you might go 5 years or 10 years. Maybe if you did the action, then you might have done something successful. You might created a successful business. But the cost of inaction, if you didn't do anything, that you're still in the same place that you're currently in, even after 3 years. You could have resulted into doing something. Even if this business didn't work out, at least you tried that you did this business rather than not doing it and suffer every single day wishing that you've done this business but you didn't. This is the idea behind fear setting. It's just 3 pages. The first is you write what is the thing that you're fearing the most, and you define what is the worst case scenario. You prevent it, and in case something wrong happened, you would repair it. The second page is you would ask what are the benefits if I did this kind of thing? What is the ups? What is the benefits if I actually did this thing that I've been fearing of for quite a while? And the third page it is the cost of inaction. If I didn't do anything, what would happen to me from an emotional or physical or financial wise? What would happen to me if I didn't do anything at all? The idea behind fear setting or premeditatio malorum is to actually embrace practice. The whole idea of doing all of this is to practice, is to prepare ourselves of what might come and how to enter in this situation that is dealt with uncertainty and chaos. We need to deal with it that in a way that we are currently ready for this kind of fear or any other fears similar to those. The idea behind it that you've done your best preparing, and this is how you control this fear or similar fears to it. You want to think of this kind of practice, like premeditatio malorum or fear setting, as a practice as an immunity to fear, immunity to weakness, to your own sense of doubt and hesitation. It's to a position that you practice, even if you think that about something you cannot do, or you might find it that has more capacity than you considered possible. Are you capable of doing this kind of dealing with this kind of fear and doing this action that you always wanted to do? The idea behind premeditatio malorum or fear setting is that you're writing a blueprint on what you can do. Is that you would write what's the worst thing that can happen? You can prevent or find solutions that can decrease the issues from this kind of thing and practice on reducing fear in the future. You might have overcome one certain thing, but you might fear something else as well. The idea behind of it is that you need to prepare yourself for multiple kind of fears. So fear setting and premeditatio malorum, the idea behind of them is that to prepare you for dealing with fear in general, much more than just a specific thing. It's not a tool to be used to deal with one certain thing. Let's say, for example, if I feared of changing my job, okay, if it worked out for you, then that's totally good. But what if you actually feared something else in the future? What can we do? The idea behind of it is that you're trying to deal with certain things in the future. You're not dealing with one certain thing only. So when you're practicing negative visualization and you're practicing it on one type of fear, you've prepared yourself for the ability to deal with other fears in the future much more easier than what you're trying to do at the current moment. You are now more prepared than you were before. So you won't be feared that much from handling this certain thing. Maybe the thing that you feared in the past is now easier to deal with in the current future. That the idea behind negative visualization will become much more easier for you to do than before. So, when we say about negative visualization, premeditatio malorum, and fear setting, it's not just you just do them from one certain thing. It works. You might deal with this certain issue, but later on in the future, when you're dealing with another type of fear, would you use those tools to deal with the same fear that you've dealt with in the past, or would you fear and you would paralyze yourself like you did before? So it's not just about dealing with one certain thing at this current moment and just moving on. While this works, but it's about making ourselves much more tougher and to be able to sustain certain fears in the future. So it's about mental toughness and having a tool accessible for us to do. Maybe the idea behind premeditatio malorum is quite interesting to you, but fear setting might be quite difficult that you found a way that you found it much more suitable for you to do. If you found a way to do it, then you can utilize this exact same model on any type of fear you want to deal with in the future. But you still need practice on dealing with certain fears. You might want to start with dealing with small fears in the beginning, rather than jumping on big fears at the first start. When you realize that you're capable of dealing with small fears, then you're capable of dealing with moderate type of fears, things that are quite big than the things that we tried to face with before. So, for example, you might start with dealing with that difficult conversation that you want to do with this certain someone. This is a small kind of fear. Then you might want to move towards changing your job. This is a moderate type of fear. When you've practiced good enough on those kind of fear, you might resolve into doing a something kind of a fear that is quite big, like moving to a new city or moving to a new country. Imagine if you want to move to a new country from the beginning. It would be much more difficult for you than to actually deal with the things, the small things or the moderate things that are affecting us as well. It cleared up our mental capacity to be able to deal with those big fears much more easier than trying to deal with the big fear and those moderate and small fears still occupying our mind. So, dealing with the small fears first, then deal with the moderate fears, then we deal with the big kind of fears in the future. So, these tools that I've provided are tools to be used to dealing with fear. The idea behind them is to benefit and to deal with certain fears. You might find different kind of ways to deal with fears. There are books written on how to deal with fear in details. There are other self-help books you might read. But the thing that I found most effective about the premeditatio malorum is that it is very straightforward and realistic. I've tried this when I wanted to do the podcast in November. I feared that one of the things that I feared doing this podcast in the first place. So I wrote down what the worst thing that can probably happen and what are the benefits if I did this podcast and what happens if I didn't do any kind of action, if I didn't start the podcast in the beginning. I was going to launch the podcast in November, but then it stretched out to that I started it in March rather than starting it in November. That is the equivalent of almost 4 to 5 months of inaction. So I've seen that if I didn't do anything, my life haven't changed that much. But if I released episodes in the future, and in the near future, let's say 2 to 3 years, my episodes might change someone else's life, or it might help someone advance in their career. I've actually benefited someone on the long term. But if I didn't do anything for the podcast, then the podcast wouldn't actually exist and I wouldn't have actually benefited at all for doing it. So the benefits of starting the podcast were much more higher than the inaction itself. So this is why I've decided after a while to begin with. There was this fear of whether my content was going to be good or whether someone is going to look at the content and make fun of them or they don't like them. There was this kind of fear when I was starting to start out, but I've decided to deal with the fear because the benefits of doing this podcast outweighs much more than the issues that I'm going to face in the future.